From SiriusXM's Doctor Radio, this is Coronavirus. Everything you need to know now.
From Doctor Radio Reports, here's Dr. Mark Siegel.
Dr. Vin Gupta is not just a physician, he's a Master of Public Administration Science. He's affiliated associated assistant professor of health metrics sciences at the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, that's IHME, which has played a major role throughout the pandemic at the University of Washington in Seattle. He's a pulmonary and critical care physician by training, which, by the way, since everybody's pontificating throughout the pandemic, I want to point out, you know what? It's pulmonary doctors that actually understand respiratory viruses the best. We often forget that. It's not some wacko on social media. It's actually a pulmonary critical care physician like Dr. Gupta. He's actively commissioned as a major in the United States Air Force Reserve Medical Corps. He's principal scientist at Amazon, provides clinical and strategic leadership to the company's internal and external COVID-19 response work. He's a team member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Does it get any better than this? He's also young. He's an NBC contributor. Vin, welcome.
Dr. Siegel, always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So where are we heading with this? I wanted to bring you into the Israel discussion because Israel's, I've called a laboratory for the Pfizer vaccine, and they were pretty disturbed about the amount of severe breakthrough that they were seeing, after 4, 5, 6 months. And now they're feeling that the boosters really helped a lot. Where are we heading in terms of both the Delta variant and the vaccine usage?
I'll start by forecasting out for all your listeners where we're headed. We do think, and these are forecasts built by my colleagues at the University of Washington, that we are in for a reprieve through the end of October. So we do expect all this progress in terms of declining cases, hospitals becoming less stressed to continue for the next 4 weeks. And yet, as a respiratory doc, I really worry about the months of November to February because the air gets colder, it gets drier. Respiratory viruses like flu, like respiratory syncytial virus, they rear their head more because they like cold, dry air. That will remain true for COVID-19. So we're going to expect coronavirus to become more prevalent, continue to transmit at higher rates. We're going to see cases uptick. Hospitals continue to get stressed again well into December, January. So it's important for everybody to recognize, yes, we're making progress, but we're still plateauing to a certain degree at an extremely high level of daily deaths, 1,000 to 1,500. We're expecting daily deaths through the end of December. Coupled with that, we don't really know what to expect with flu. I talked to some of my colleagues out in Australia. Remember, what happens in Australia and Southeast Asia in their winter, in some ways predicts what's going to happen in our winter when it comes to flu many months later. They didn't have a terrible flu season. And so what does that mean for us? It's hard to know. Are we going to get lucky again like we did last year and not have any flu? Are we going to have a lot of flu because everybody's normalizing life as they should? Open question. But as a lung doc, I'll say our hospitals remain stressed, not because we don't have beds, Dr. Siegel, but as you know, staffing shortages really are driving the existing surges. So that's where we're headed. I don't think we're going to really feel a true psychological reprieve until the end of Q1 2022. And then I do think normalcy is really going to feel very attainable, and we can really feel like we're past the worst of this from all sources, not just COVID. On the question about boosters, I think the data from Israel is really clear as it's clear here in the United States. To me, this is not controversial, that those who need boosters are those that are high risk, 60 and older, or if you have a serious underlying medical condition and you're less than 60 years of age. That's what we're seeing from hundreds of millions of data points in the United States, that amongst those that are fully vaccinated, 80% of those individuals that are actually dying despite being fully vaccinated are over the age of 65. Frankly, we don't talk enough about this, but the Israel data, when you look at the data and stratify it, that's exactly the same type of finding. So giving boosters to those that are high risk is good policy, but I'd like to see more of the world vaccinated and us buying less vaccine so that we can distribute more of it elsewhere so we don't have another Delta variant.
I agree with every word you just said so clearly and eloquently, except I want to challenge you on one point. But I agree with the way you characterize flu by starting with the Australia data. I've written books on flu. I think that it's open-ended right now where we're going to end up because they had another mild season, but I think you're right. We have to prepare. I think your description of how a respiratory virus works is eloquent and very, very important that we understand that we're talking about a pandemic strain here, but usually these are seasonal viruses, usually not pandemic strains.
Right.
But the one thing I want to question, and not because I know the answer, by the way, Dr. Gupta, is there's also the question of transmissibility. So I don't think we know the data on this, but wouldn't there be a value to extending your booster program down lower if the following thing is true? If perhaps we gave the 2 shots too close together, we don't know that yet. Perhaps it should have been a higher dose in older people, we don't know that yet. I mean, in other words, could you potentially get a gain out of boosting? And I'll get to the world issue, which you already brought up, which is so important. And Larry Gostin's been talking about that on the show a lot. And Madhu Pai is brilliant on this from Montreal. But yep. I'll get to the world picture on this. But don't you think there's an advantage of boosting perhaps to decrease transmissibility?
Absolutely. But I think it depends on us defining, Dr. Siegel, what is it that we're aiming to control? What's success look like? What's the end outcome here? If it's testing positive or having mild symptoms, then a booster shot, it's hard to argue against getting a 3rd shot because we do know that that additional shot, even if you're young, otherwise healthy, it's going to decrease your risk of testing positive and then potentially being infectious to somebody else. However, 2 shots, if you're otherwise healthy, less than 65, seems to protect against infectiousness quite well already. And so the question here is, if the purpose of vaccination is to keep folks out of the hospital, and we could disagree on this, but I think that has to be the goal now and in the future, that we vaccinate to prevent severe illness. We don't vaccinate to prevent infectiousness or mild symptoms, because I think the former is just impossible to achieve at scale. I feel like we're going to be in a never-ending cycle of boosting. And I'll also say, as a military doc, I work with the veteran community. A lot of my vets are unvaccinated. They're some of the hardest to turn, and a lot of them have emphysema and are making really silly decisions about their own health. But we try to have a respectful conversation. I'm trying to turn them. And what they tell me is, hey, doc, what I'm getting from all this booster talk is that 2 shots doesn't work. It feels like the vaccines don't work. That's a really prevalent line of thinking amongst those that remain unvaccinated. Now you're telling me I need a 3rd shot. When am I going to need a 4th shot? So whether we agree with that thinking or not, I do worry about how this is being perceived, this debate, when it still feels like our ultimate goal here, protecting against hospitalization, we're meeting that mark with 2 shots for most people.
A great answer. I would only provoke you a little further because I agree with that answer completely. And I think a lot of people are getting the wrong message on the boosters, that we also have done a poor job, and I don't know who's done a poor job and who hasn't. And you've done a great job, by the way, in the message that one of the purposes of the vaccine is to protect the community. Because you see, what happens is if you only talk about the vaccine to prevent severe illness, then people start saying it's personal choice. It's not personal choice. It's part of a public health response to decrease the amount of virus circulating in the world, which has all kinds of bad outcomes, which I'm going to keep asking you about, when we're going to get to the world situation. We need to decrease the amount of virus there is, and vaccines are a big tool towards that, right?
I don't disagree. And yet the waning effectiveness that was seen in the Israeli studies, or frankly, studies across geographies, when we look at just testing positive, mild symptoms, infectiousness, those numbers that are being cited, the average age of the Israeli cohort, when I looked at the waning effectiveness of Pfizer, was 68. And so it's so hard for me, in my view, to still extrapolate from that study and say, well, if you're less than 60 otherwise healthy, you definitely need a 3rd shot to protect the community. I think it's an open question. And I worry that we're making critical trade-offs. What I don't like is when I hear Press Secretary Jen Psaki say it's a false choice, boosters or vaccinating the world, we can do both. No, I think there's a trade-off. We're hearing from the Pan-American Health Organization, PAHO, which represents parts of Latin America, that they are being priced out, that they cannot get enough vaccine from COVAX, the distributing mechanism from WHO, to get vaccines, because COVAX pays less than the US or the UK or you name it, any other high-income country for the same amount of vaccine. So market forces are driving where vaccine is going. So when Press Secretary Psaki and others in the White House are blaming Moderna, for example, for not doing more to produce vaccine, well, I think Moderna and others could push back and say, look at what you're doing. You're oversupplying the United States. You don't need to. We can have plenty of boosters for those that need it, and you're pricing out those that need it, i.e. COVAX, from actually being able to purchase vaccine to distribute it to countries that need it.
That is really powerfully said. I am so enjoying this. I want to throw in what Madhu Pai, who I'm becoming a big fan of, mainly because he looked after my poor daughter when she got COVID in Montreal recently, by the way. He was advising me. But Dr. Pai has another thought to add to this, which I think you're going to resonate with, which is he says, promises aren't delivery. So it's good that the president is promising 1 billion doses. And, yes, we can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. And yes, we've been the world leader in the fight against HIV/AIDS with PEPFAR lately. He's saying promise, but actually deliver the vaccine. Don't deliver the vaccine at the end of 2022 when the thing has spread already like wildfire and more variants have emerged. So how do you get from a promise to an actual shot in arm?
That's a great question, Dr. Siegel. This is what I would say. I think there's enough supply that exists out there that we can start talking about redistribution and do so at a scale that the Biden administration, frankly, has been very incremental on. One thought here is, and you will often hear this, I'm sure Dr. Pai has referenced this as well, is that logistics is determining who can and cannot get the best vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. And yet that's no longer relevant. Countries across sub-Saharan Africa are developing cool ports. Basically at airports, they have big freezers that can hold at cold storage temperatures, at minus 80 degree Fahrenheit temperatures, the Pfizer and vaccine products. And that vaccine allotment is then is good for a long period of time, many months. Those vaccines are stored in specially designed containers that can then last for 10 days, even out in austere environments. So we have a situation here where you can actually embed the best vaccines that we have an oversupply of in any country in the world, using these cool ports based at international airports in these countries, and then a distribution mechanism that can last for 10 days because of these specially designed containers. I think we've underestimated the logistics and operations behind what is achievable right now. And we're throwing up our hands and saying, well, why don't we just give more shots to the people who've already received them?
And, the argument that vaccines end up in crates on loading docks and not in arms is really outdated because of PEPFAR. PEPFAR has really shown that we can do it. We have the muscle to do it. We have the ability to play the world leader in this. It looks like you hit the nail on the head with COVAX. There was another disappointing story about COVAX yesterday. Beyond the United States' role, which again, I agree with you that the president is rising to the occasion here, and I see us participating heavily. Beyond the United States' role, what else is there?
Well, there is going to be some expectation of companies that have done really well in the pandemic, like Moderna, to build manufacturing capabilities in other regions. And yet Moderna coming out and saying that they're going to build a manufacturing hub for vaccines in Africa, that's a medium-term play. That's going to be helpful if we have a pandemic at the end of this decade. That will be helpful, but it's going to take 3 to 5 years to transfer the technology, to build the infrastructure, to get that plant up and running at scale. So we need more of that, number one, but that's for medium-term pandemic preparedness. In the short term, the WHO really needs to align every high-income government in the world to build momentum around this concept of mixing and matching vaccines. What will that do? What that will do is it will normalize for every country in the world that, okay, Pfizer and Moderna, while they may seem like they're gold standard, if you mix and match them with Sinopharm or AstraZeneca or what's available in many parts of the global south, it will diversify options. It will make some governments feel like they're not getting second-tier vaccines. We will have more vaccines for more people. Right now, there's a lot of vaccine tiering happening where people think that Sinopharm, Sinovac, AstraZeneca, they're just not as good. So they're declining some of that product. What they're waiting for, I'm not sure. It's not like they are going to get Pfizer product anytime soon. WHO, the United States, and other countries accepting that 2 doses of any vaccine, frankly, will still keep you out of the hospital. And that's the case with some of these overseas vaccines, whether we like it or not, will be helpful to immunize the world, because it will normalize the concept that any 2 doses of any WHO-approved vaccine does the same thing, with some exceptions, equally well. It keeps you out of the hospital.
Yeah, I would say, by the way, a little caveat there. From what I'm hearing, I think the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine is terrific. And I'd say that the Sinovac vaccine is not that great. And I've heard some problems with Sputnik V as well. That's just things I've heard on the show here. But clearly, AstraZeneca is a home run vaccine, and it's been utilized and can be utilized more.
You're 100% correct. I think AstraZeneca is on par with vaccines we have in the United States. I would say Sinovac and Sinopharm are very clearly not effective when it comes to mitigating mild symptoms of COVID. It appears that breakthrough illness is very common, mild illness especially. But surgings in hospitals in countries that have adopted those vaccines, like the Maldives, Mongolia, the Seychelles, is just not happening. So I do think that there's still benefit when we're talking about immunizing the world. I recognize that high-income countries, it's a different calculus, because we funded the development of the best vaccine. So there's a feeling that we should have first dibs on them.
I mean, Jennifer Nuzzo has said on the show very eloquently and elsewhere, like, where rich countries hoarding vaccines that end up expiring and have to be thrown out, while poor countries can't get any vaccine. Dr. Gupta, talk to me about some more metrics here. What about testing? Because I feel that our model for testing is kind of off. I think I've always said, and I'm not alone, I'm getting this really from Michael Mina at Harvard, but really we should have a free rapid test in every home. We should be testing kids before they go to school. We talk about masks, which are really valuable, but testing maybe even more so, because after all, if you knew you had the thing, you wouldn't go out of the house. I mean, what are we still underutilizing testing here?
I think to a degree we are, and I'm helping some school districts across the country with this concept of test to stay, which I know Dr. Mina and others have also talked about, this concept that, and I think this applies to more than just schools, it should apply to workplaces, that if you're a close contact exposure and you're unvaccinated, in the case of our children at least, that if you test negative, you can still stay in the classroom. And that's common sense. It's sensible. It's our pathway towards normalcy. And that's what we're seeing pilots across the country pop up to help understand best practices for that paradigm. So that is fantastic, because the last thing we want to do is have one case shut down a classroom for 10 days. That would be highly disruptive and really defeat the point of where we're headed, which is towards an evidence-based strategy to keep kids in classrooms. I would say that, testing aside, we're making rapid COVID testing available to everybody at home, which I love. I think that's going to be fantastic when it comes to medium-term pandemic resiliency. So the next pandemic will have all these tools available at home that we didn't have back in early 2020. My concern with all this availability of uniplex testing, so testing for one disease, is, as we talked about earlier, Dr. Siegel, we're entering cold and flu season. And every school district across the country has said, if you have COVID-like symptoms, stay home. And so if somebody tests negative for COVID, what does that mean? Does that mean that just because they have a sniffle, they have to stay home? Technically speaking, in most districts, the answer to that is yes. And so this forces us that as we're innovating, we need to be innovating in the right ways. As you know, and at NYU, at the UW here in Seattle, if you come in with sniffles or respiratory symptoms, you get a respiratory panel of tests to look for COVID, but to also look for flu, to look for RSV. We need wide rule outs here. And these multiplex tests, testing for multiple diseases, are innovating. They're in the pipeline as we speak. So it's just to say that this is an unfinished story. If we are really going to use these tests to determine who can and cannot come into school, we need to recognize that a negative COVID test does not necessarily mean you can go to school if you have the sniffles. The symptom profile still it trumps whatever that negative test might show. That's why we need these multiplex tests, so that folks can feel comfortable explaining to school administrators why they have the sniffles, if I'm making sense. So that's key here. And I'll lastly just say, we don't shut down schools or make kids mask in the setting of any normal cold and flu season. RSV in any given year in any given flu season causes 80,000 cases, 500 pediatric deaths. 80,000 pediatric cases, 500 pediatric deaths. What have we seen over the course of COVID? COVID has caused about 500 pediatric deaths over an 18-month period. maybe 3 to 4% of our hundreds of millions of cases are as a result of COVID. But again, the hospital strain has been quite minimal. We need to start thinking about how we, in a sensible way, start removing some of these controls. I think testing is reasonable through the end of cold and flu season with the qualifications I just mentioned. But we also need to think about context now. Once kids get vaccinated, we need to really normalize and rapidly move towards normalcy in classrooms.
That's a really, really, really great answer. I'm only going to ask for one tiny deeper dive as a pulmonologist. Explain for our listeners a little bit more about the different tests, because with flu, there's a vast array of testing. There's swabs for everything. There's antigens. There's PCRs. So what do you envision that multi-platform test being? Would it be a swab that because we can do a swab now that you send for RSV and for flu. So it would be one swab that you send for all three, correct?
Envision, if all your listeners out there, envision a world that's not in the too distant future where you just stick a swab up your nose if you have sniffles and it's December of 2022 and you put it into a little cartridge that you'll get mailed to you at home. That will tell you if you have COVID 2022, flu that's circulating next winter season, or RSV. Those tests are being developed as we speak. So the simplicity of a uniplex test, these BinAx now tests you can get at Walgreens or CVS, that's going to be applied for multiple diseases at one time. So one test can sense for the presence of multiple diseases. And that's exactly what we need, because then that will help align that testing strategy with our quarantining strategy, which is really largely based, Dr. Siegel, on symptoms. That stay home if you have a cough or a runny nose. We don't really care what the test is. So that's what I want everybody to recognize here is, and I've heard this from parents across the country, there is a fundamental disconnect between this appropriate increase in access to testing and yet the ways in which we think about who should stay at home. It's really about symptom profile. So we need to align the tests that we're offering with that approach on symptoms, or say, you know what, if a COVID test is negative and you have a runny nose, you can come into school. One or the other, but something's got to give.
Yeah, it sounds like you're more symptom driven, correct? Your attitude is more symptom. You don't want people that are sick in school.
I think in the short term, since we're figuring everything out, it makes more sense to keep somebody with symptoms at home because we know that there's imperfections in these rapid tests. And yet, I also think to the second point I was making, we accept that their kids get sick. We want
right,
kids
and they go to school. Right, and they go to school.
Yeah, right. We need a sensible strategy here. I want my kid to develop natural defenses. I believe in the hygiene hypothesis. So we have to be pragmatic in how much we control illness. Sickness is an okay part of life.
This is a fascinating discussion. The hygiene hypothesis has been advanced greatly by our own Marty Blazer, who studied it for years here, and we had enormous discussions with him. He was our former chair of medicine at NYU. I agree with every point you're making. Talk to me a little bit about vaccines in kids, because you started to go there. What's your thoughts on that?
I think that what we're seeing is it's all about risk benefit. And I understand why 30% of parents say they want to do wait and see, because let's be honest, we've scared the heck out of parents across the country by saying that their kids might have inflamed hearts. At least that's the message a lot of parents have gotten. I mean, that sounds scary. To you and I, it's not scary because we live and breathe this stuff, and the statistics are top of mind that the incidence of mild myocarditis is 1 in 100,000, 0.0001%. But the way media talks about it feels like it's much more likely. My thought here is a 2-dose vaccine that's a third of the dose of the adult vaccine. This is in reference to Pfizer, and this Pfizer pediatric vaccine. It's going to be approved by Halloween time. I think that the risk of ending up in the hospital for your child, depending on the state, can be as high as 4%. We're seeing that 4% of caseloads in certain states are accounted for by a pediatric population. It's not in every state, but that's a pretty significant number. And yet the risk of something like mild myocarditis is 0.0001%. So risk benefit just for the health of the child is so obviously in favor of just getting your kids vaccinated. I think the secondary reason, it just doesn't hold as much water for me. I don't like the idea of vaccinating our kids so that we prevent transmission chains and prevent our adults from getting infected. Adults should just get vaccinated. And so I understand I understand the notion why parents would say, why would we put something into our kids that feels uncomfortable to us only to prevent transmission chains that are impacting adults? I mean, that's how some people are thinking about this. I understand why they would get upset if that's being cited as the primary reason, which is why I think we need to stop talking about that as a good reason to get kids vaccinated and focus on the child's health specifically.
Talk to me in the remaining moments about Amazon. What can you say to me about Amazon and your role there and how it applies to the pandemic?
It's been interesting. I joined Amazon back in early 2020, and what was a full-time role at the time, still was clinical, still having some external roles, but to help scale their virtual telemedicine home, Amazon Care. And this notion being that technology companies could do what often academic institutions have a hard time doing, which is creating a great user experience, making the patient journey just easier. Like, think about Prime Health and the convenience of care at home. That's why I joined. I said, let's try to do healthcare better. And the pandemic hit, and ever since, I've witnessed a multinational company innovate in spaces like diagnostic testing, over-the-counter testing at home, leveraging its massive logistics operation to distribute saliva tests for school districts, to move vaccine products across the world. We moved oxygen tanks to India. It's pretty incredible what a company like Amazon could do when it comes to middle and last mile healthcare delivery. So from my standpoint, I don't know what the future holds for me, but having a sense of what the private sector can do, having spent so many years in the public sector in India, I think only makes me be better able to help guide organizations and to speak to the American public.
He just explained why we like FedEx better than the U.S. Post Office. Dr. Vin Gupta, from the University of Washington, a great physician, scientist, pulmonologist, and really a great media force as well. Thank you so much for joining me today on Dr. Radio Report. It's a great pleasure and honor. I hope you'll come back soon.
Thank you, Dr. Siegel. Absolutely.
Get facts, not fear, from SiriusXM's Dr. Radio, presented by the leading experts from NYU Langone Health. To learn more about Dr. Radio, including shows and schedules, go to SiriusXM.com/Dr. Radio.